Great for joining me on this afternoon to talk all about carbon. Very exciting. So my name is Hannah. I'm Hannah Williams, and I'm the impact manager here at Goodloop. But apart from that, I am a scientist at heart. I have a master's in conservation biology, and I've actually spent time out in rural Mozambique collecting data on coral bleaching and the effects that it can have on the community. So I've seen firsthand the effects of climate change. And here's a silly photo of me pulling a face 30 meters below sea level in the Indo-Pacific, just to prove the point. But when I'm not gallivanting around coral reefs, I am the impact manager at Goodloop, and I head up every aspect of our impact, from charitable donations and impact reporting to our carbon footprint and our B Corp. So I've been here for just over 2 years, and I flipping love it. So just a bit of sort of recap on last week's. Amy set a great scene for the climate crisis and the role that the advertising industry can play. So we also covered that we're not climate warriors. We do have sustainability sins. Some people don't like fish. They don't think they're cute. Clearly from my intro, that one wasn't me. But although we're not climate warriors, we are here because we know that we need to make a difference. Currently, the planet and humanity are suffering because of our collective actions. And as Bill rightly said, we have a superpower. We are the whispers that influence human behavior change. So I believe that the advertising industry is an incredibly important piece of the climate change puzzle, but we're often overlooked and underestimated. We literally shape consumer behavior, and that in itself can save lives. As Amy mentioned last week, banning the adverts of cigarettes on TV in the US literally reduced the amount of deaths caused by lung cancer. Like, people's lives were saved. But this also means that we need to be really careful, clear, and concise about how we communicate our green credentials to make sure that we don't mislead consumers. So there is a lot of carbon jargon out there. In this session, I'm hopefully going to dispel some of the jargon and help make sustainability a little bit more accessible. And then next week, the wonderful Claire will be introducing you to the next steps that you can take to detox your digital advertising. Just a little shout out, don't forget to join our LinkedIn group. It's a really lovely place to sort of discuss all things carbon and sustainability. And if you have any questions or comments after this session, our team will be there so we can drop you a reply, or we can discuss anything further if you'd like to. And then sort of moving on to today's agenda, so we all know what to expect. A little note here that closed captions are enabled. So if you want subtitles, be sure to turn that on. I think it's a little setting at the bottom that says closed captions. So firstly, I'll be talking you through why it's important to get this jargon right. Then we'll have Hannah Cox introduce carbon accounting and scopes 1, 2, and 3. Then I'll be talking about a few of the carbon terms that are commonly used and what they mean. We'll then hear from Elliot Murphy, who will introduce BVCM. I'll talk about offsetting, and then Josh will weigh in on tree planting. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for some questions. If you have questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function as well. A couple of the team are sort of looking over that, so they'll let me know if we get anything submitted. So, as I said, there's a lot of jargon. These 4 terms are thrown around all the time, but some of the terms are actually created by our own industry, such as personal carbon footprint, to sort of take the blame off big corporations. But some of it is genuinely useful to help demonstrate green credentials and communicate to consumers how a company or a brand is reducing their emissions. So although some of them are made up, some of them are really handy. So it's important that we understand the difference. So I just want you to reflect quietly on these 4 terms: carbon neutral, net zero, climate positive, and carbon positive. If I asked you right now, do you think that you could comfortably explain the difference between those 4 terms to me? And then with that in mind, how many of you are aware of your company's or clients' carbon commitments based off these terms? And then maybe have a think about if you've been part of a campaign that maybe is focused on these topics, and whether you truly understood what the messaging was saying and what these words meant. Well, a study commissioned by the ASA in October 2022 actually highlights that you're not alone if you don't understand the difference between these four terms. Whilst carbon neutral and net zero were actually the terms that consumers were most familiar with, they did actually view that these two were interchangeable, and consumers were often using them in sort of place of one another, and they didn't understand what the difference was, despite there being quite a significant difference between them. But are we surprised? If you drove past this Nando's ad on the street, would you consider the weight of this carbon neutral claim? Or, for example, if this ad said net zero instead of carbon neutral, would you understand what that difference was, or how much different that ad was from the carbon neutral one? Well, in a piece of research released by Brand Finance, they actually found that 62% of consumers believe claims made by sustainability claims made by brands. However, 79% also said that they had reduced the use of their brand once they discovered it was acting unsustainably. So this to me highlights why it's really important that consumers understand the difference between these two terms, because they're very loaded and they do mean very different things. And it's important that we educate consumers to avoid any greenwashing or false advertising claims. Nobody wants those. So before we can really understand the nuances between these terms, we need an introduction to carbon accounting, as these help shape the difference between the terms. We have Hannah Cox, who has submitted a video here to help understand the difference between scopes 1, 2, and 3. Hannah is a sustainable impact leader. She's the founder of the Better Business Network and also hosts carbon literacy training for professionals. So I'll hand over to Hannah.
Hi guys, it's Hannah from Better Not Stop and the Better Business Network, and I'm here today to tell you all about carbon accounting. Very exciting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm interested in it, why you should be interested in it, and I'm going to dispel some of the jargon and the jargon that you might have heard before, just to explain it so that you've got a bit more of an understanding about carbon emissions when you're thinking about your own business. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between being a carbon neutral business and a net zero business. Now, to be a carbon neutral business, what you need to do is you need to measure the emissions that your business creates, and then you need to offset them. Businesses do this in lots of different ways. You can use tree planting, but there's lots of other different ways to offset your carbon footprint, but that's one of the most popular ways. So to be a carbon neutral business, all you need to do is measure what you're doing and then offset what you're doing. So for example, the average person creates about 9 tonnes of carbon emissions a year. So all they would need to do to offset that is just pay for 9 tonnes of carbon to be offset. However, as we know, just offsetting what we're doing doesn't justify it. So becoming a net zero business means looking at how many emissions you have, trying to reduce them as much as humanly possible, and then offsetting the rest. So if we use this as an example of a normal person that is creating 9 tonnes of carbon a year, you could look at reducing your emissions through perhaps flying less, using renewable energy in your home, reducing the amount of meat you eat, eating more locally, and you can reduce your emissions down in all those different ways and then offset your emissions afterwards. So that would be like a net zero strategy for a person. But for businesses, when we're measuring our carbon footprint, what does that look like? Well, firstly, you need to understand what your footprint is. And there are 3 different types of scopes that we talk about when we talk about our carbon emissions. Our greenhouse gas emissions are measured and assessed within these 3 different scopes. So why are there 3 different scopes, and what does that mean? Well, there are scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So 3 different types of emissions that your business can make. Now, these names come from something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the world's most widely used accounting standard when we're talking about our greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, what you're doing when you're doing your carbon footprint is you're measuring these 3 different scopes, and then you're trying to reduce down every single one of these scopes, then you're offsetting it. That is what having a net zero strategy is. Your scope 1 emissions cover the emissions from sources that you as an organisation owns or controls directly. So an example of this you would be burning fuel in your vehicles that you use for work. So those would be in your Scope 1 emissions. Now on to our Scope 2 emissions. Now our Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that you cause indirectly when the energy you purchase and uses is produced. For example, if you had electric vehicles, the emissions from the generation of the electricity they're powered by would fall into this category. So there is Scope 1 and 2 is really dependent on the type of business you have. But up on screen now will be a table showing the difference between your Scope 1 and 2 emissions and what you would put in these two different categories. As you can see on the outside are your Scope 3 emissions. Now, your Scope 3 emissions are anything that is not produced by the company yourself and not the result of assets controlled by the company. So, for example, if you're a company, let's say that you produce a product in a factory, then the emissions of Scope 1 and 2 would include things like the energy used to power your factory, as well as the energy used to create the products that you're making. But a Scope 3 emission of your business would be the energy used by your workers to come into work, for example. So for your employees to come to work in the factory, that would obviously have a carbon emission. For example, if they were driving in or taking the bus, for example, that would have a carbon emission. So that would be a Scope 3 emission of your business. And also, after your product's been sold, your product still could create more carbon emissions. So for if it gets recycled or goes into landfill or gets burnt, all of that process is going to have a carbon emission as well. So there's things that are happening basically before your business product or service is created, sits in your Scope 3, and also what's after your product or service is created. So that table in front of you now should be very clear of showing you the difference between your Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. Now what you, I'm sure, have already identified here is it will be quite easy for you to measure your Scope 1 and 2 emissions as a business, but actually a lot more difficult to be measuring your Scope 3 emissions. For example, if you've got over 1,000 people that work in your office, to measure your Scope 3 emissions, you'd have to be thinking about how are all those people getting to and from work every day? What kind of vehicle do they have? How far do they drive? You'd also be having to think about, well, if, for example, I'm driving my kids into school and then from school I'm going into work, what carbon emissions am I measuring from that trip? Is it the whole trip, or am I measuring just from the school to work? So there's lots of different factors that are really affecting your Scope 3, which makes it so hard to measure that within your business. Many businesses focus on looking to reduce their Scope 1 and 2 emissions because these are the ones that they're more able to control the data of and also more able to control the changes. A company is more likely to be able to control what energy supplies they use or what factory they create their product in than how they tell their employees to get into work. So hopefully that explains the difference between Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, and that table up on your screen also gives you a really good visual representation of what those different emissions are. So the most important thing, of course, is measuring your emissions and then looking at how you can reduce them. It's going to be easier for you to reduce your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and it's going to be much more difficult to reduce your Scope 3. Your Scope 3 is going to be a lot usually within educating both your employees and your suppliers and maybe other stakeholders in the business. So when we're talking about carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality and race to net zero, the three things you need to be thinking about when looking at your carbon emissions of the business are: net zero is when you're looking at all of your emissions and doing everything you humanly possibly can to reduce those and then offsetting. Carbon offsetting is just looking at your emissions and reducing them and using carbon offsetting tools to counteract them, So things like carbon offsetting is knowing how much carbon you're producing and then turning that into an offset by capturing carbon in other ways, like tree planting or mangrove forests or loads of other amazing things, or even things like keeping the natural environment how it is so less carbon is released into the atmosphere. So a carbon offsetting project can also be carbon capture in making sure we look after our existing natural countryside. And then the third one is carbon neutrality, which is when you're measuring your emissions and you're offsetting them to make your business carbon neutral. So you can see here, even when I'm explaining it, and it's something I do every day as a job, it can be quite confusing to think about the different meanings of the different words. But essentially, what you want a business to be doing is creating a net zero strategy, measuring their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions as much as they physically can, and putting in plans to reduce them where they can as well. At Better Not Stop, we run a carbon literacy for professionals course to not only help your employees learn about and understand climate science, but also empower them to learn about scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and what they can do within the organisations to help reduce them. We also provide that carbon literacy for professionals course through Better Business Network for free. So there are other companies that do carbon literacy training also, but that's also a very good start. Not just knowing what you're doing, but also understanding how you can reduce it is a really, really clear way to change what you're doing as a business. So finally, how can you get started in your own business to look at your carbon accounting? The first thing I would do would be to use a tool like scoop.eco to measure the kind of basic carbon footprint of your company. If you're a larger organisation, the best thing to do is to get a professional to come in, either who is trained in measuring carbon footprinting to actually measure your specific scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions in your business. Once you know what you're dealing with, that's the stage where you can start to look at measurements, reduction strategies and also putting targets in how to reduce your carbon footprint. At this stage, I would definitely look at doing some carbon literacy in your business so that your employees understand what there is that needs to be done, and also helps empower them in helping you with suggestions of what to do to measure and reduce your carbon footprint. And finally, I'd be looking at offsetting. So there's plenty of options out there when it comes to carbon offsetting, but it's definitely not the first point of call. It should be part of a further journey and a further strategy in creating a net zero plan for your organisation. If you have any other questions on carbon footprinting, carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality, anything to do with carbon, feel free to get in touch with me. You'll be able to find me on LinkedIn. I hope this has been useful for you, and I hope this has given you a bit of an idea about what all those different terms mean. And I hope you enjoy learning more about what you can do to be part of the solution when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, there we are. So there's Hannah Cox talking about scopes 1, 2 and 3, and she briefly touches on the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, but I will be delving a little bit deeper into those just now to help clear up any sort of leftover confusion. I also just wanted to mention that I have done one of Hannah's carbon literacy for professional courses, and they are great. They're really good fun, so would highly recommend. So carbon neutral versus net zero. These terms are often used interchangeably, but as mentioned before, often consumers or brands don't actually understand what they mean, or they assume them to mean the same thing. But there are some key differences to be aware of that make these terms actually incredibly different. So it's really important to have these definitions in mind before you make any claims about your business's carbon neutrality or net zero commitments. Carbon neutral. So carbon neutrality is a state of net zero CO2e emissions across scopes 1 and 2, and optionally 3. This can be achieved by balancing emissions of carbon dioxide with its removal, often through carbon offsetting. So it's important to note here that being carbon neutral means that you haven't made any reductions and you're not committed to reducing your carbon. You've not made any commitment to be net zero, but you are mitigating what you release. I just also wanted to note here that you'll see we use CO2e a lot, and this is actually a term that means CO2 equivalent, and that means that it's using all of the greenhouse gases and measuring them based off their global warming potential. So when you see CO2e, it means CO2 plus all the other greenhouse gases. So a real world example of a carbon neutral commitment. Apple. As it stands, Apple is carbon neutral, and by 2030, all of their products will be too. As it stands today, Apple have not committed to be net zero by 2030. They do not have a net zero target. They have just committed to be carbon neutral. To a consumer, this looks really great. Like, you come across this and you go, cool, great, Apple's great for the planet. Maybe I'll buy their product instead of someone else's. But being carbon neutral is merely a stepping stone and should absolutely, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, not be an end goal. So for Apple to be using carbon neutral and shouting about it and saying that this is a really great commitment and they're different for committing to this is, in my opinion, not good enough. And if we're gonna reach 1.5 degrees of warming and not overshoot that, all companies, especially big ones, need to be committing to net zero. So net zero. Net zero is a lot more complicated. It involves a lot more steps than carbon neutrality. I like to see it as carbon neutral's younger, better looking, and generally cooler sibling. And being net zero means that you've calculated your CO2 emissions across all three scopes. That's 1, 2, and 3. You've reduced your emissions in line with scientific guidelines, and you only offset the remaining 10% of unavoidable carbon. So you've not only measured your carbon, you have committed to reduce it, and you have only offset 10%. Another thing to note here is that the removal credits, your offsets, can only come from carbon removal rather than carbon avoidance, but we'll touch on that in just a minute. And a real world example of a potentially misleading claim. So when I see this move to zero slogan, I assume that they've got a net zero strategy because they're moving towards zero. Sounds great, let's buy some new shoes. But as of today, Nike don't have a net zero commitment. This means that they are moving towards being better, but they haven't officially committed to net zero emissions. So to me, this is an example of how you have to be careful with your terminology, because carbon neutral and net zero are super different. And just a tool to mention here, actually, that if Shana, you can pop it in the chat, there's a website called netzerotracker.net, and you can actually have a look at big companies' net zero commitments or lack thereof, and compare them and see what they've committed to, what they report on, and that's a really great tool here. So this is a table that just sort of really is a real brief overview that should highlight some of those key differences here. Carbon neutral, you only need to report on scopes 1 and 2. You don't have to bother with scope 3 if you don't fancy it. You don't have to make any reductions, and you can just offset everything by planting more trees. That means you're carbon neutral. If you're net zero, it means that you have reported on all 3 scopes, you have committed to reducing across scopes 1, 2, and 3, and you only offset your residual unavoidable emissions, which can only be up to 10%. Here are another 2 terms. Isn't it fun? There's so much jargon. These 2 I actually see used interchangeably more often than the other 2, but they are very different. So I did just want to touch on them, not quite in as much depth, but just to make note of them because it's important to understand them. Climate positive. Climate positive means that you've gone beyond, above and beyond being net zero. So you don't emit much. The only bit that you do emit, you offset, so you are net zero. But this means that you've actually removed more greenhouse gases than you've emitted. And this can be assisted by BVCM, that's beyond value chain mitigation, that Elliot will talk about in just a minute. So this is like the end goal. This is a dream company who is making up for all the companies who are still emitting a shed load of carbon. These guys are doing all the legwork to help emit that help mitigate that carbon as well. And then we've got carbon positive. This one is actually a marketing term. Sometimes people use it to describe a company that emits more than they mitigate. Sometimes people use it to mean the same thing as carbon negative, but just a more positive term. But it's a very confusing term and we tend to avoid using it. So if possible, we try not to use this one because it means too many different things. So now we will hear from Elliot Murphy, who is a carbon accounting specialist at Ecology. He is going to take us through beyond value chain mitigation, what it is, why we need it, and how you can get started on your BVCM journey.
Hi, I'm Elliot Murphy, a carbon accountant at Ecology. Today, I'm here to talk about Beyond Value Chain Mitigation. Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, or BVCM, refers to the funding of climate action on your net zero journey. The Science Based Targets initiative, who created the net zero framework, reports that setting a net zero target by mid-century is now often viewed as the minimum that a company should be looking to achieve. We need to go further if we want to protect our planet for future generations. If we consider a reduction in your business and supply chain emissions as a first priority, BVCM is the next step which helps to mitigate the impact that we have on the planet. Companies should not purchase carbon credits as a replacement for reducing emissions in line with their net zero targets. However, purchasing high quality carbon credits in addition to reducing emissions as part of a net zero strategy can play a critical role in accelerating the transition to net zero emissions at a global level. But why do we need BVCM? As part of the 2015 Paris Agreement, countries across the world are committed to trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is an ambitious goal, and the SBTi created their net zero framework to help businesses achieve this. And while corporate decarbonisation will play a critical role in reaching societal net zero, the SBTi highlight two reasons why targets alone may be insufficient. The first is that a significant amount of emissions occur beyond the reach of corporate supply chains. And secondly, net zero emissions is what's needed from all companies to achieve this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And while companies on the net zero journey represent a significant and growing share of the economy, the majority of companies do not have emissions reduction targets that are aligned with net zero. Even under optimistic projections, there's an enormous gap between where we're headed in 2030 and where we need to be, as reported by the UN Environment Programme in 2021. Based on current commitments, emissions are on track to reach 56 gigatons of CO2e by 2030, and that's over twice what they should be. To fill this gap, it is essential for governments to strengthen their climate action, as well as implementing policies, plans and laws to enable the achievement of net zero targets. There is also a significant opportunity to address this gap by investing in activities that lie beyond our supply chains, such as investing in forest conservation to eliminate deforestation by 2030, scaling up forest restoration and investing in carbon removal technologies or other climate-related tech. By mobilising additional beyond value chain mitigation, companies and individuals like yourselves can help to protect and repair our planet and take responsibility for the impact that we have. As you know, beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM, is a critical part of the net zero journey. This journey is a complex one with a variety of twists and turns. If you want to begin funding BVCM, there's three things that you should consider. To begin with, an accurate and comprehensive carbon footprint is vital. This will not only help you to understand where your emissions are coming from, but will also allow you to fund a proportionate amount of climate action. An effective carbon footprint should include your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and allow you to identify the main contributors to your carbon footprint so that you can take efficient action to reduce emissions. There are three main ways that you can calculate your carbon footprint. At Ecology, we combine a spend-based approach with activity data to calculate users' carbon footprint on our Ecology Zero platform. This is a great way to calculate the carbon footprint of businesses within the professional services sector. However, for businesses that manufacture products, a life cycle assessment that assesses the impact of manufactured goods throughout their entire use may be a bit more suitable. Once you have your footprint, the next step is to consider how you reduce your business emissions. If you're on a net zero journey, this can be done by setting and achieving near-term and long-term net zero targets. Near-term targets cover the next 5 to 10 years and typically require a 42% reduction by 2030. Long-term targets are those that most people will associate with net zero, and these typically involve a reduction of emissions by at least 90% by 2050. Once you've prioritised reductions in emissions, it's time to consider how you invest in BVCM. There's a huge amount of climate action initiatives out there, and appropriate due diligence should always be taken to ensure that what you invest in is proportional to the impact that you have, is a reputable scheme, and that it is impactful to both local communities and the environment. You may also want to consider what's important to you, your business, and your customers. For example, a surfing company may wish to protect marine habitats that not only protect native species, but also sequester carbon. Other companies may wish to directly address the impact that they have on the planet. For example, a company that produces paper may wish to invest in the reforestation projects or the development of technologies that allow for more efficient recycling of waste. However you invest in beyond value chain mitigation, it's important that you invest in things that have a real impact on climate change so we can move towards a greener future together.
So as Elliot mentioned there, beyond value chain mitigation is something that the SBTI, which is the Science Based Target Initiative, considers something that it's really, really important for companies to invest in, because although a net zero target is the bare minimum that all companies should be doing, if we invest above and beyond that, we're not only mitigating carbon now, but we're actually investing in a greener and more sustainable future. So it's something that we should all be considering. But a big part of that is offsetting. So as I mentioned before, and as Hannah mentioned in her video, offsetting is key to both being carbon neutral and net zero. But there's a couple of different types, so we'll just sort of run through those now so we can understand them in a little bit more depth. I see offsetting as like balancing out the scales of your carbon footprint. It's the process of buying certified carbon credits to mitigate your carbon emissions. So these carbon credits flow horizontally between companies trading carbon revenue. When one company or organization removes a unit of carbon from the atmosphere as part of their normal business activity, they can generate a carbon credit. Other net emitting companies can then purchase this credit to mitigate their own emissions. So it's balanced. But when purchasing offset credits, there is a minefield of options and it can be really overwhelming. But hey, here's a great new money-making tactic for you all, so listen up. Whip down your local garden centre and buy some tree saplings, they're usually a couple of quid. Plant them in your back garden and call it a small forest. If you market this as afforestation and you make a rough guess at what carbon might be sequestered by your trees, put them online and sell them for a huge profit to big companies that are emitting a shed load of carbon, and you've just sold your first carbon credit. Congrats. But it sounds too good to be true, right? That's because it is. It's way more complicated than that. How much carbon was actually sequestered? How much should you be selling them for? How will we know when the carbon has been removed? This is why regulation and verification is really important, especially in the carbon credit market. So verification ensures that consumers receive proper value for their money and that the projects are operating in a sustainable and regulated manner. Organizations that set protocols and verify projects such as gold standards are definitely the first port of call and are key when purchasing offset credits. There are two overarching types of offsets to be aware of: carbon avoidance and carbon removal. So carbon avoidance is generally a lot easier to get hold of on the open carbon market, a little bit cheaper usually. So for example, investing in renewable energy will avoid carbon because it takes investment away from fossil fuels. Or protecting a forest will avoid carbon because it will prevent deforestation. On the other hand, we have removal or sequestration, which is the credit that can be used for your net zero strategy. And these are projects that actively remove carbon from our atmosphere. So we can do this via tech-based, nature-based, or a hybrid solution of both of them. So for example, we can plant trees that increases the planet's capacity to be able to absorb carbon, or we can use strategies such as direct carbon capture that filters air and buries it really deep underground. But it's important to note here that I see offsetting as kind of like drinking a green smoothie after a big night out. It might make you feel a bit better, might mitigate some of your hangover symptoms, but the best solution is actually to just not drink as much the night before. So although offsetting does mitigate carbon, the first solution should always be reduction. And as a couple of people have mentioned already, Hannah and Elliot and myself, tree planting is a potential way to offset your carbon, or at least to be used as a beyond value chain mitigation technique. But is tree planting good or bad? It's the question that a lot of people ask. So we now have Josh Rayner to talk us through how tree planting can be good for the planet and how it's actually really important, but it's important to ensure that we invest in the right projects.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm one of the account executives here at Ecology. Is tree planting good or bad? Planting trees is one of the best ways we can support the health of our planet, but it must be done responsibly to have the greatest possible impact. Some of the important aspects of responsible tree planting include planting in suitable places. Generally, the best tree planting projects are reforestation projects rather than afforestation projects. This means that planting trees where trees used to exist but no longer do, usually due to human activity, rather than planting trees in places where trees have not historically grown. This maximizes the chance of survival of the trees because the habitat is more likely to be suitable for the trees. Planting the right species. The trees you plant should fit into and support the local and natural ecosystem. This means that you have to plant species that naturally exist or should exist in the local area and will thrive in the local climate. Planting a biodiverse habitat. When designing a tree planting project, the whole ecosystem needs to be considered. Just planting one species often results in an ecological desert, supporting very little local wildlife. By planting a mix of species, it is possible to maximize the amount of life habitat can be supported, creating a biodiverse, healthy, and more resilient ecosystem. Planting at the right time. Trees need to be planted at the right time of year, usually in what is known as the rainy season, which is late autumn, winter, or early spring in the UK. It is important to consider which species should be planted first, and which will do better once some trees have become established. For example, some trees do better when existing trees provide them with some shade, while others need lots of sunlight and extra space to thrive. While planting takes place over several years, replicating the natural process by which species colonize a new area, this is ecological succession, can be facilitated better than with short-term projects. Being led by local people. It's crucial that the people who live under tree planting project areas are involved in the project design and implementation. Often, local and indigenous people have the knowledge that is vital for the success of the project, so it's important that they are involved in the project from the start. Also, the future success of the trees planting often relies on trees being cared for and protected by local people. It is therefore crucial that those people are passionate about the project, are invited to and want to help in it succeeding. Part of involving local people is ensuring the project benefits their lives, such as by designing the project so it creates new income streams or food sources, or enhances ecosystems such as water supply. If tree planting is not done properly, it can actually have a negative impact on both the environment and local people's lives. For example, planting a species in a drought-prone area, which can result in increased water scarcity, which can reduce crop yields and increase mortality amongst local wildlife and existing trees. Can you give an example of the impacts they can have on the environment? Responsible reforestation projects can bring a multitude of benefits to the environment, including creating shelter and food sources for local animal species, including threatened and vulnerable species, encouraging other local species to recolonize by creating an ideal environment and conditions for them. This includes providing shade for shade-living species, trapping and evaporating water, and to keep soils damp. Trapping sediment help prevent soil degradation and desertification. and raising the water levels of rivers by preventing water from escaping from the ecosystem, supporting aquatic life as well as terrestrial species that rely on rivers as a water source. It is also worth noting that ecology does not count tree planting as a verified carbon offset, but for more information on that, please visit our website. Thank you.
So there we have it. There's our 4 most commonly used jargon terms, and the keen eye amongst us will notice that I've switched out carbon positive for net emitter because you can't get that wrong. It's obvious what that means. They are an emitting company. So we're avoiding using carbon positive. So here are the 4 sort of as a spectrum listed from good to not so good. So if you're making a plan as a company or you're working with a client and they say any of these words, you can put them on a spectrum as to how good or bad that is and make a plan for your carbon journey. So starting from being an emitter to being carbon neutral, to making your commitments for reducing carbon and becoming net zero, to hopefully eventually becoming a climate positive company who is actually better for the planet than other companies. So there's your goal. One thing to take from today is we should all be climate positive and make a good impact on the planet. So thank you for listening to me and the special guests. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to either say them out loud, put them in the chat, or put them in the Q&A box.
Cool. We've got a question through from Tori, which I can ask on her behalf. What are Goodloop's carbon commitments now and going forward?
Very good question. So Goodloop has been carbon neutral since we started 6 years ago. We have always considered carbon with our purchase decisions. So for example, we've always bought secondhand tech. We use secondhand laptops, refurbished. We don't buy new. We tend to prioritize train travel or taking the bus rather than driving or taking a plane. So it's something that we've always been conscious of. We are certified as net carbon negative by BEMA, but we're currently in, I'd say, a transitionary period where we're working alongside some third parties to really closely dig into our footprint and analyze it to work out where there's space for reduction in line with scientific targets. So we're starting from an already quite carbon conscious, low carbon stance. So hopefully we can dig a little bit deeper because there's always room for improvement. So watch this space.
Cool. We've got a question from Chris asking, does carbon neutrality include measuring the impact of digital services?
No, so carbon neutrality, well, it can do. So carbon neutrality as its base definition means scopes 1 and 2. So that's direct emissions. So that's your vehicles you use as a company and your electricity and heating in your offices. That doesn't necessarily include scope 3. It can do, but doesn't have to. So you can offset your digital emissions, which is a scope 3 emission, and be carbon neutral, but it's not required under the carbon neutrality definition.
Cool. And we have one more from Carol. Do you have an example of a company who has a good commitment to net zero?
I do. I often use Unilever as my sort of poster child for a great carbon commitment. They are really nailing it, honestly. They have made a net zero commitment in line with SBTi. They have committed to be net zero by 2039, but they've actually released a detailed plan on how they want to achieve this across all 3 scopes. And they're actually looking to reduce scopes 1 and 2 by 100% by 2030, which is a very ambitious goal. But what's so sort of admirable with Unilever is that they've released their carbon action plan that's on their website, and they detail exactly how they're going to achieve that. Because it's one thing making a big like hoo-ha saying we're going to be carbon neutral or net zero by so and so date, but if you can't show how you're going to achieve that, then it's just a load of jargon. So a really key part of making those commitments is actually detailing the plan and how you're going to get there.
Cool. that's all the questions we have in the chat at the moment. I don't know if there's a few minutes if people want to add some more questions in, but I feel like they can also add them into the LinkedIn group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can catch me on LinkedIn if you want to chat about anything carbon or sustainability, or just fangirl about corals. That's my jam. And yeah, I'll be on the LinkedIn group if you've got any questions. Thank you everyone for joining. Have 10 minutes back. Go have a cup of tea. See ya.